Erev Tov Chavrim, I'm Stephen Ben-Nun. You are watching Israeli News Live, and it is hitting the fan once again. I guess that's a rude way of putting it, but in Syria, Aleppo this time. Different reports are coming out right now. Right here, we're seeing a huge explosion in the Hamadaya, which is in West Aleppo. It is believed to be that this was a arms depot where this took place. Aleppo News is showing the aftermath of this massive explosion. And it is believed that Al-Qaeda actually launched a rocket on this particular location. And but at the same time, as we're seeing this, and of course, like I said, it is a massive explosion right there. We are also getting reports from Amman News there that breaking intense clashes are breaking out between the Syrian army and Turkish-backed forces in East Aleppo. You know, if for any reason, if the Syrian army gets in a direct confrontation with Turkish forces, not just Turkish-backed forces, you know, this could easily bring in NATO as a backup or justify them attacking the Syrian country, regardless of what Russia may or may not say. And in fact, at this particular point, with President Putin is showing a tremendous amount of weakness in the case of the latest provocations there when Israel came in. And of course, it is conflicting reports as to whether or not Israel used the Russian Il-20 surveillance plane as a means of cover for the operation in Latvia, or whether or not the plane was not used for cover, as the Israeli authorities are saying, and saying that their plane was already out of the area and back inside of Israel before the plane was actually shot down by Syrian forces. But it's a very awkward situation right now. Russia, President Putin is saying that this was just a tragic era that took place, and at the same time, some of his generals and even his defense minister, Sergei, is certainly saying that this is something that will require a response in the near future. I don't know how that's going to go. I certainly would rather see this whole situation in the Middle East come to an end. There's definitely no end in sight. Israel is now talking about moving on an offensive, no longer a defensive. That's been said publicly, but yet at the same time, Israel has been pretty much on the offense for the last year inside of Syria, and there seems to be no let up in sight. In fact, Israeli forces, after meeting with their counterparts in Russia, have come back and said that the strikes in Syria will not cease, and there has been no change of plans of how they communicate with the Russians inside of the Syrian airspace. So kind of just let you know, when you see these types of communiques between Russia and Israel, that tells me that the alliance between President Putin and that of the Israeli leader, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, is much closer than what it appears publicly. So many people believing that Putin will be the one that attacks the Israeli state. That would really be a major, major escalation for Russia to do so. I just don't see it happening whatsoever. This is more photos as well, just showing it. Al-Qaeda just fired a heavy rocket on Aleppo's busiest neighborhood, and that's another way that it was put. And this is troubling as well when we think in light of the fact that there's always the arms, ammunition depots that are being targeted by the Syrian government. It's not Iranian targets that are being targeted. Neither was the one that was in the southern part, south of Idlib, that was being targeted. Each time this has been a case where the Syrian ammunition depots are being targeted. I mentioned the one not south of Idlib, but in the case of Damascus, when Israeli jets also bombed an ammunition depot just outside or right near the Syrian military air base. And it seems to me that what the purpose for this is to make sure that Al-Qaeda and Al-Nusra keep that upper hand. I just hate seeing that. Because after all, who are we really supporting when we do this? You know, I actually was looking at, where is it? Right here. Wanted to share with you just to give you some images, to give you an idea of what is happening and what are we really supporting. In this case right here, these young ladies here are planting trees in Syria for President Bashar al-Assad, and they are the faces of freedom in Syria. But I also wanted you to see the faces of Al-Qaeda. What do the women look like with Al-Qaeda? Now this is a magazine, Al-Qaeda launches women's magazine. This was in April of 2011, just to kind of give you an idea. But this is for across cultures, women's tends towards grabbing a glossy fashion magazine. And this is the very picture of their magazine. This is the trend for women of Al-Qaeda. It's also the same for al-Nusra. It's the same for ISIS. In fact, in ISIS, and some of them, you don't even get to see the little slit in the eyes there. They kind of have like a little wire mesh, like a chicken coop or something over these poor girls' heads. You know, and again, like I've stated many times before, if a woman is a Muslim woman wants to wear a burqa, you know, she wants to wear her head covering, okay, then that's her right. That's her freedom of religion to do so. But this is a situation where many of these women, like in the case they show continually over and over in Iran, where these women are taking off the burqa, they don't want anything to do with it. They're tired of being subjugated to men and being beaten, beheaded, killed, and everything else by these groups. And they would rather to have freedom, such as in the case of Syrian women, where these young girls here look like most of them are teenagers, probably 16 to 18, something of this effect here, but none of them have to be imprisoned inside of their clothes. And this is what we should stand with. This is standing with Bashar al-Assad and his people that do not gas their people, do not lie to the public. It's not written in neither is it written inside, we hear so much about what the Quran writes. Well, it's not written in the Talmud that you're allowed to go lie to the Gentiles in order to be able to be their friends, because it's perfectly okay to do if you're doing it for Yehovah. You know, this is the type of nonsense and propaganda that goes on, and it's troubling to me, and I'm just really getting really fed up. I'm thinking seriously about doing a broadcast for you guys here on Israeli News Live and show you exactly what Al-Qaeda and al-Nusra is, ISIS militants. Normally the U.S. says they don't support ISIS. Israel doesn't say that, but yet we're the ones that created it. You know, the U.S. and Israel created ISIS militants. You know, I had a good friend of mine in the Israeli IDF. He was since out, but he shared with me, and I've shared that with you before, how that ISIS militants had, some of their leaders were seen with tzitzit coming out from underneath their garb. Well, that's kind of interesting, don't you think? Well, after all, as I said the other day, Russian media was showing that Israel was not only supplying the small arms, as they've been saying, but also missiles to Al-Qaeda and al-Nusra across the border in the Golan. And we're also seeing, medical supplies. I don't fault Israel for this at all, even if it is the enemy. I cannot fault for supplying medical supplies for anyone in the case of a war. But at the same time, though, they have put sanctions on the Syrian government, and they don't allow any medical supplies to go into the Syrian government while their children are dying of different diseases and things that are preventable, all because of the sanctions placed on Syria that keep life-saving drugs going into the hands of the Syrian government. But they will supply those drugs to the very murderers that imprison their women, as I showed you here, and they'll supply it for them, no problems asked. I mean, we got to think of what side of the equation are we on? In fact, there's something we're going to be doing over on. Let me see if I can find the article for you real quick here. I'm going to be doing a special broadcast on. This is from Breaking Israel News. From evangelizing Christians to humble servant in Jerusalem, the story of Pastor David Decker. And nothing against Pastor Decker at all. I'm not using this to beat up on him or anything. But I am seeing a trend. Going to share it over on Patreon later today. This very troubling trend that I am seeing, where the Christian community is slowly but surely dropping Yeshua. They're dropping Jesus completely out of their message, and they're embracing Judaism. You know, we often hear that we have Judeo-Christian values in America. And I used to always say the same thing. But you know, in reality, we cannot say that Christians are Judeo-Christian value unless we are Talmudist as well. Because Judeo values of today are Talmudist values. It is very prominent in the Jewish culture and community. I know I used to go to synagogues as well as Kabbalah, depending on which group that you're associated with. The Chabad organization is into Kabbalah. I've sat there with rabbis teaching Kabbalah before, the Gematria, Talmud, etc. That is Judeo values. I think, though, in reality, though, the true Christian, it shouldn't be Judeo-Christian values. Maybe we should say that we are Karaite Jews values, Karaite Jewish values, not Judeo, which is more associated with Talmudic values, which has been there all along. Back in the times of Yeshua, we didn't have a Talmud written as of yet, but we were still quoting the verbal law in those days, as Yeshua cites those verbal laws inside the Gospels. In fact, I'm going to be going back to Shem Tov's Hebrew Gospel with you guys in the very near future, working on translating that myself to get a little bit better perspective of things that are said there, because this is probably the oldest known Hebraic document of the Hebrew Bible, and it is believed to be that Shem Tov's Hebrew Gospel, which was copied in the 1300s, goes all the way back to the 1st century. And they proved this. In fact, it was Nehemiah Gordon that actually did a very beautiful job in proving the authenticity of this document, and of course where it comes from, the different copies that are out there that Shem Tov would have taken this from. So I think we should use it because some of the very interesting artifacts in the Hebrew version make Scripture far more clear. So I'm going to actually work on translating that myself as well to share that with you. So later today, I hope to get into this right here about this, why I'm very troubled that I'm seeing the things that are happening, because so many of our Christian brothers and sisters are willing to forsake the true values of Yeshua in favor of that of Judeo values, which are Talmudic values. Just like the Noahide laws. You ever notice the Noahide laws explicitly omit the Sabbath? Why do they omit the Sabbath? Because in the Talmud, it is taught in the Talmud that the Sabbath is not for Gentiles. It is only for the Jews. And that those Gentiles that keep Sabbath are to be put to death. You didn't know that, did you? Yeah, believe it or not, that's in a Talmudic law. I have my own Talmud. I know these things. All right? But another problem with this that a lot of people are not aware of, though, is that's totally contrary to the Word of God, because God gave the Sabbath in the book of Genesis long before we were ever an Israelite nation, before we were ever 12 tribes or even split off, house of Judah, house of Israel. So the Sabbath was given then. Yeshua brings back the Sabbath in his own ministry, and speaking about keeping the Sabbath, and of course we see it in the book of Revelation as part of the commandments of God, and even with the rich young ruler. So no, nowhere do we see Yeshua ever refer that we should be keeping the Noahide Talmudic laws that are being put around the world. So we'll go into that on that broadcast there. Anyway, I just want to get to you guys and let you know the breaking news that's going on, what's happening there. And maybe I'll just kind of bring this out. Intense clashes broke out between the Syrian Arab army and Turkish-backed rebels in East Aleppo this evening after a relatively quiet few months. According to a military source in Damascus, the intense clashes broke out after the Syrian Arab army fired a couple of mortar shells towards the Free Syrian Army's positions at El Bab in East Aleppo. In response, the Turkish-backed rebels fired several missiles towards the Syrian Arab army positions in nearby town of Tadaf, which is just south of Al Bab. See, that just goes to show you, they're always provoking things. And that's the way it is with all these so-called chemical weapons attack. It is a provocation. I'm Stephen Ben-Nun. You're watching Israeli News Live. Erev Tov.